Evolution, Chapter 40, The Other Cousin. When Kevin was a kid, all he'd had was his mother. She'd never remarried after his dad and didn't have a large family to begin with her parents having died when she was young. But he was starting to realize just how large the Tennyson family really was.
So, I'm sorry, how are you guys related to this girl?
He asked Jen, scratching his head as Gwen went to collect said relative from the mall they had passed. Sunny had jumped out of the car while it was still moving. If Kevin hadn't been in a school zone, she would have been badly injured. She's our cousin. Kevin frowned.
But I thought I knew all your cousins.
Jen shook her head. Hardly. You've met Gwen's brother Ken, but that's it. You haven't met cousin Lucy, Clyde, Sunny, or Joel. We have a large extended family. Grandpa Max has a brother and a sister, after all. Kevin nodded.
Okay. And which one is this one again? I wasn't paying attention.
Cousin Sunny. We haven't seen her since we were really little kids, ages ago. But that's not too surprising. She's our cousin through Grandma Verdona's side of the family. Kevin blinked.
Scary Grandma has more kids than just your dad and Gwen's dad?
Jen raised an eyebrow at him. You know, technically Grandma Verdona never married Grandpa Max. Not by human standards, anyway. I guarantee she has other kids. Very free-spirited. Jen glanced out the window. Gwen was dragging Sunny to the car. Her computer beeped from its spot in Kevin's lap. We got robots. We should go. Gwen nodded, shoving Sunny into the back seat by Jen, who shrugged at Sunny's complaints. Sunny, turning out to be a full-fledged Anodite wearing a skin suit, explained why she looked like Gwen if she had black hair and blue eyes. Her boyfriend, being a 12-foot-tall troll-like alien, was a bit of a surprise. But the two of them getting pissed off and nearly setting off a fusion bomb, well, that was the last straw. Jen turned into stardust and blasted Antonio out of the building. I'll take care of the boyfriend if you've got the snotty cousin. Gwen nodded as Jen swooped out of the building. As Kevin began to disarm the bomb, Antonio stared.
Anodites can't be different colors,
he said in confusion. Jen swooped around him, a bubble of mana trailing her. I'm one of a kind, big guy. She grinned as she sent the bubble spinning. Antonio cried out as he went spinning out on the soccer field nearby. Their fight was pretty short. Jen rolled the ball containing the unconscious Antonio out onto the asphalt as Grandma Verdona trapped Sunny in a bubble of mana. Verdona grinned. My two favorite grandchildren, Sunny pouted. Gwen thinks she's too good to be an Anodite, and Jen's not even real. There's no green Anodites. Grandma Verdona glared at Sunny. Sunny, I have no idea how you ended up such a spoiled brat. You are a born energy being. You should understand by now that more things are possible than even we can imagine. You're being self-destructive on purpose to try and prove you're better, and it's just making you worse. Your parents and I will be having a talk. Verdona smiled at Jen and Gwen as she floated up into the air again. Have fun, you two. She grinned, waving as Jen turned back to normal. She took Sunny and Antonio, disappearing into the atmosphere. Kevin whistled.
Your grandma is terrifying.
Jen laughed as Gwen nodded. You're not wrong, the redhead stated, stepping over to him and wrapping an arm around him. He smiled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Jen grinned at them and stepped down the street. Kevin frowned.
Where are you going?
Jen shrugged. You two could use the night alone. I'm going to stretch my wings. She spun the dial on the Omnitrix and flew off as Big Chill. She landed on the roof of her house before turning back to herself. She pulled the mirror Chimecaster had given her out of her pocket. She turned it over in her hands a few times before slipping it back into her pocket. Instead, she climbed into her window and frowned around her room for something to do. She found the field notebook waiting on her bed. She picked it up, frowning slightly. She wasn't sure what to make of the current situation the night was in. She sighed and set the notebook aside, deciding that she wanted an early night instead. She kicked off her shoes, pulled off her jacket, and flopped down onto the bed, pulling the blanket over her. Gregory was having a quiet morning. He hummed to himself as he shelved a few books. He frowned as he picked one up off the table at the back of the library. This was usually where George could be found, with his nose in a book, or more often these days, a news article about Jen. He'd been very interested in the shapeshifter since meeting her in Gregory's Skype chat. He frowned a bit. There were a few articles scattered around across the table about the Forever Knights and Jen putting a stop to their many heists. Gregory frowned as he collected the articles. He left his cart behind, deciding to return them to the man himself. He should still be in bed. He tapped on the door to his room. There was no answer. He tapped a little louder.
Come in,
Came the clear response. Gregory opened the door and frowned slightly. George spent most of his time in a wheelchair. Gregory wasn't sure how old he was, but he was very old. But now he stood in the middle of the room, pulling on a plain jacket. He smiled at Gregory, but it was a bit melancholy.
Is everything all right?
Gregory nodded.
I feel like I should be asking you that.
George glanced down at something in his hand. He shook his head.
Just preparing for a journey, my friend.
Gregory's frown deepened.
A journey? What are you talking about?
George frowned down at the item in his hand.
Things that should never have been unlocked are free upon the world once again. I must finish the mission I began so long ago. I wonder if you would accompany me.
Gregory caught the coin he tossed to him. He blinked. It was a gold coin emblazoned with the Forever Knight symbol. He stumbled backwards.
You're more than I seem, yes. Just like your friend Jennifer. I understand why you left the Order. It has become twisted from what it was meant to be. It is time for things to be set right.
He glanced back down at the other item in his hand, and Gregory caught a glimpse of a stone with a crack in the face. He stuttered.
I can't go back.
He managed to stammer out, and George nodded.
I understand. Thank you for your care, Gregory.
George bowed and walked out past Gregory, who stood stock still as George slipped the coin out of his slack grip. Before Gregory could even turn, George was gone. Sandra Tennyson was awoken by a screaming cry from her daughter's room. Both she and Carl were on their feet in seconds, Carl grabbing the laser gun off the wall. They took off into her room, expecting a full-on fight waiting for them, but found only Jen sitting up in bed, panting as hard as if she had just run several miles. They glanced around, Sandra stepping over to Jen. "What's wrong, sweetie?" Jen shook her head. "Nothing. Just a nightmare." Carl frowned.
Sounded like a bad one. You want to talk about it?
Jen shook her head as her phone began to buzz. "Hey, Gwen." "Yeah, no, you didn't wake me up." Jen frowned, throwing back the blankets and slipping her shoes on. "A disturbance in the mana field? Like a disturbance in the Force?" Jen rolled her eyes, slipping on her jacket. "Yeah, you on your way?" "Cool, I'll meet you and Kevin on the corner." Sandra frowned and stepped into her daughter's way. "I don't like you keeping such late hours, young lady." Jen hugged her mom. "I don't like it much either, but no way I'm getting more sleep right now. Might as well help some people while I'm awake." She hugged her father and slipped between them and out the door. Carl shook his head slightly.
"She's just like my dad."
Sandra laughed lightly. "Yeah, she really is." Sandra yawned and linked arms with her husband, and they made their way back to bed. Chapter 41. Betrayal. Finding a Forever Knight seal infused with magic was odd, to say the least. The fact that it was 1,700 years old was weirder. But the thing that had escaped from it was the weirdest part. It was a slimy green thing with darker green stripes and red glowing eyes. It was holding onto a prone police officer when they found it. The knight in charge, Sir Cyrus, ordered his knights to open fire on the creature. Jen and the others intervened. Jen turned into Artemis and fired the laser lances out of the knight's hands. Gwen went to free the police officer, only for the creature to finally look up. It hissed, and two feelers reached out and grabbed hold of Gwen, one on either side of her head. She screamed for a moment, then her eyes flooded with the same sickly green as the creature's skin. She whirled, her hands glowing brightly. "You!" she screamed loudly as the knights dove to the side. For one instant, Kevin thought she was pointing at him. But then a chant fell from her lips in a language that echoed around the alleyway. It made no sense to him, but a large pink portal shot through with the red of the creature's eyes appeared behind Jen. Before she had a chance to call out, her feet left the ground and she slammed into the portal which closed around her. She got one shot off before she vanished in a swirl of pink. Kevin raced forward to Gwen, his skin covered in the metal of the knight's armor. He slammed into the creature and it released her. She dropped to her knees as the creature tried to take hold of him. It didn't seem to be able to, though, and slammed its front legs into the ground, sending up a cloud of dirt as it did. The creature hissed again, snatching up the nearest human, which happened to be Sir Cyrus's squire, Winston. It clubbed the boy around the head, knocking him out cold, and raced off as Kevin raced to Gwen. She was holding her head as if in pain. Jen had not reappeared. Kevin held on to Gwen as she shook her head. "What happened?" She asked, her voice shaking. Kevin shook his head. For once in his life, he had absolutely no answers, not even a witty remark. He was reasonably certain Gwen had just killed her cousin. Jen had no idea what was happening. Everything was a swirl of pink and green. She couldn't focus, she couldn't transform, she couldn't even hear herself scream. Then, in an instant, it was over. She was on her feet again and drew another arrow from thin air, which was lucky. She fired it off, striking the green slimy creature she was standing in front of. She blinked. She should have been in the alley in Bellwood, but that was nowhere near where she was. A battlefield surrounded her, covered in bodies and more of the green creatures. Laying near her was a figure in shining armor. The armor wasn't intact, though. There was a long slash along his side. Setting aside her confusion, she knelt by the dying man and placed a hand on him. It took a moment to heal him, but she managed it before she was attacked by another of the creatures. She wrestled with the thing before the tip of a sword sprouted from its face, and she managed to scramble away from it. The knight she had healed was back on his feet. He wielded a gleaming sword that Jen recognized from her vision. She started backwards as she got a look at his face. It was the same knight from her vision as well. All that was missing was a roar interrupted her train of thought. As flames sprouted from the air, the knight pulled her to her feet. "Stand and fight! I have no time to care for a young one now." Jen drew another arrow from the air and fired it into the leg of a creature leaping at the knight from behind. He blinked as he spotted the Ultimatrix symbol that sat at the shoulder of Artemis's chiton. "The sign of the swordsmith. To me, knights! We must rally and drive off the creature!" Several people pulled themselves to their feet and began to fight the creatures with renewed vigor. Jen had no idea what was going on, but she had enough training to know that in the middle of a war, you stayed alive and figured out details after. It didn't take them too long to rout the creatures as the hissing, roaring black cloud retreated and the knights cheered. The blonde one, the one Jen had healed when she'd appeared on the field, removed his helmet and bowed to her. "My lady, you have saved my life. I owe you a debt that can never be repaid. May I know the name of the healer who has rescued me and my men?" Jen blinked at him, and at that moment the Ultimatrix decided to time out. Green lights flashed, and she stood before them in her normal form. The sound of steel on steel heralded the redrawing of swords all around her. The blond knight raised his own, pointing it at the knights around him. "Is all courtesy dead? Stow your weapons!" They hesitated. "But, Sir George, she is a changeling." George grabbed her hand gently, turning it so the Ultimatrix was visible, the iconic green hourglass glowing at her wrist. "She bears the symbol of the swordsmith. She is no threat to us." He bowed again. "You will accompany us back to the castle. The king will wish to meet you." She blinked at him in confusion as the knights around him murmured and stowed their weapons. "I'm sorry, I have no idea where I even am." George frowned slightly. "I am Sir George, of the great kingdom of Albion. What is your name, young changeling?" he asked kindly, looking her over. "My name is Jen Tennyson.